All right, so here we are in section 6.3. Remember, we've been talking about the xylem and the phloem and how those different organs are arranged inside of the stem. And we left off with talking about the buds that can turn into shoots or they could turn into flowers. Now we're going to talk about the flower part, the parts of the flower. Okay? So flowers are important. They are the sexual reproduction kind of organ of the plant. This is where fertilization occurs. The fruit is formed, and within that fruit is going to be the seed. The seed is what we're going to plant next year. That's how we reproduce. That's how plants reproduce and continue on growing. So the flowers are going to vary in shape and form. They can be useful in plant identification. We have complete flowers that contain these 4 parts. I'm going to do that again. All right, moving into section 6.3. This is going to close out chapter 6. In the previous section, we discussed the different types of tissues and some of the organs, such as the xylem and the phloem. We talked about the cortex and cambium layer. We also talked about the different components of leaves, how they have different shapes, and we talked about the stomata. We talked about the different shapes and the veins. And now we're going to talk, and we left off talking about the buds. And so the buds can either be vegetative, where they grow into new shoots, or they can be reproductive, where they grow into new flowers, or they can be both. And so now we're going to talk about the flower part of the plant. So flowers are important for sexual reproduction. This is how they produce the fruit and the seed that is going to continue on their life cycle. So we have a fertilization. It forms a fruit. Typically within that fruit is a seed that contains all the genetic information that it needs in order to reproduce and continue on as another plant. So we have 2 types of flowers, complete and incomplete. In a complete flower, we have the sepal and the petal. Next, we have flower parts, which are the stamen, which is the male part, and the pistil, which is the female part. So in order to be considered a complete flower, it must contain all 4 of these components: the sepal, the petal, the stamen, and the pistil. If it lacks 1 or more of those 4 parts, it's considered incomplete, right? So the sepals are going to be kind of these leaf-like scales. They're like at the very bottom of the flower, kind of just little bitty leaves. Next we have the petals, which makes sense. Like if you can think about roses, the rose petal is what is kind of the leafy material that is around the center of that plant. And so these 2 together, the sepals and the petals, make up the perianth. And so when I think of peri, I am thinking outside, like around, like the perimeter, the perimeter, the outside of the plant. And anth is going to be the inside. We'll talk about this a little later when we have anthesis. And so this is like the anther, which is going to be part of, that's going to have the components of the stamen and the pistil. So we have the perianth, which kind of encases the delicate parts of the inside of that flower. So within the stamen, we have the filament, which is kind of like the stem. That's where we kind of get stamen from within that flower. Now we have the anther, which is like the bulb that's on top of that stamen. And we'll go over this in a second. I've got a picture. And that is going to, and then we have the pollen, which is what actually pollinates or fertilizes the egg. So here we have the filament, since I left off there. So we have the filament and the anther is what produces the pollen. So the pollen then needs to make it to the stigma. This is the style, which goes down to the ovary, which is where the seed will begin to form, or the fruit will begin to form. So again, much like humans, okay, there's going to be a male component to the egg fertilization. It has to enter the ovary and then begins to develop something that, like, for humans that would be an embryo that is going to form into a baby, that is going to form into a human. Same thing with plants. There needs to be a male component and the female component, the genetics of that, they're going to form a new seed, which is going to be like the baby. So within the female part, we have the stigma, the style, and the ovary. The stigma, the style, and the ovary. So a complete flower, we have the sepals, which are like the little leaves at the bottom that are typically green. We have the petals, which are colorful and bright because we want to attract bees and other insects that are going to carry pollen from other plants. We have the male part, which is the stamen, that has the filament, the anther, and the pollen. And the female part, we have the stigma, the style, and the ovary. So we have 3 parts to the male and 3 parts to the female. Again, incomplete is lacking 1 or more of those 4 parts on a complete flower. And then we can have, within that, we can have perfect flowers and imperfect flowers. And so a perfect flower, this one would be considered a perfect flower, because within it we have both male and female parts. So technically, it does not need any help from anything else. Like, it's possible that this plant or this flower could reproduce without help. It's perfect. It has everything that it needs. Imperfect flowers are lacking one of the two. So this is kind of like a male flower or a female flower. And these are going to be like, I think one of the best examples is like a ginkgo tree. So ginkgos have male trees and female trees. So it's also important to remember that perfect flowers can be either incomplete or complete. So we have complete perfect, incomplete perfect if it lacks the sepals or the petals. We can have complete imperfect and incomplete imperfect, right? Let's look at that again. So a complete flower requires all 4 parts. If it lacks 1 or more of those 4 parts, it's incomplete. But we can have incomplete perfect flowers if we don't have sepals or petals. And if it's an imperfect flower, then it's already incomplete because it doesn't have all the other 4. Then within that we have 2, and then within that we have 2 different types of flowers. And so monoecious and dioecious. And so ecious meaning house. So we have 1 house or 2 houses, and you'll see what this means in a minute. So in the previous picture that we looked at, that was a monoecious plant because it had both the pistillate and the staminate in the same flower or in the same house. So monoecious, it is it's on the same plant, is monoecious, or you could consider that house. Next we have dioecious, which is what I mentioned earlier, this ginkgo, where we have separate trees. So we have a male part and a female part. We go back to this monoecious part here. Using corn, think about it, right? What we have is we have the tassel that is at the top, and then we have the flower, which is at the bottom, which turns out to be the ear, right? So they're on the same plant, male part, female part. On a dioecious plant like a ginkgo, we have a male tree and a female tree. All male flowers only have a staminate, and then on the female tree, all female flowers only have a pistillate. Okay? There are other types of flower arrangements. So we would have solitary, which is one per stalk. So if you kind of think about a corn plant, there's only one tassel at the top. There may be several female flowers, typically only two, because we're not getting a lot of corn ears from a plant. So there may be one, maybe two. We have an inflorescence, which is multiple or clusters of flowers. And then there are a ton of different inflorescent types, right? And this is something that you would likely learn in plant science lab. This is showing you the different types of plants that you would, or different inflorescence and arrangements that you would come across. That'd probably be a good idea to be able to recognize these for a test. I might have a picture and say, identify this flower arrangement, right? So spike, maybe we have a catkin, a corum, panicle, a raceme. On those flowers, we're going to have fruit, and the fruit are going to develop after the pollination and fertilization. So the first thing that's going to happen is the pollen is going to land on the stigma. Whether that be from on the same plant, or maybe that's a bee or an insect that flies from one plant to another. And it's also possible that you get pollen from a plant that you would get, let's say I'm the plant and the flower. You would have a bee travel from something that has pollen that's not the same flower as me, and then land on me. That pollen may enter the stigma, but it'll fail to fertilize. We would need the same genetics from like if I were a ginkgo, a female ginkgo plant or tree, we would need from another ginkgo in order to pollinate or fertilize this egg. So it has to be from the same species. Pollen's going to land on the stigma. That pollen will grow down through the style, which is the tube of the female part. That's the tube of the pistillate. So remember, we had that is going to then fertilize the ovule. So at the bottom in the ovary, that is going, so lands on the stigma, grows down through the style into the ovary. And then finally, the fruit begins to develop. So we'll have this pericarp. Remember, I said this is kind of the outer, so the pericarp, and develop into many different fruit structures. So if you can think about like the orange peel, that is the pericarp of the orange. A pea pod, or the skin of a peach, is actually almost like what we consider the flesh, which is the fruit that we're eating, is actually covering and protecting the seed, which is the pit. There are several types of fruit. We have simple fruit, aggregate, multiple. A simple fruit is going to form from one single ovary, from one single flower, although it may have more than one seed. Our simple fruits are then kind of separated into fleshy, dry fleshy, or dry. Our fleshy fruits are going to be kind of like our juicy fruits, right? So our tomatoes, there's an old saying that says, knowledge is knowing that a tomato's a fruit, wisdom is not putting it in fruit salad. But if you think about it, cucumber is also a fruit, and if you make cucumber and tomato salad, that would technically be considered fruit salad, wouldn't it? Something to think about. So our getting back to that, are going to be berry, Hesperidiums, and peepos. Our dry fruit, our dry fleshy fruits, where part of the fruit becomes hard, we have peaches and cherries, olives, apples, pears. This is just a look at some of the different types. So here we have a grape or a pepper. The little bitty seeds inside are what designates that as a fruit. We typically don't think of tomatoes as a fruit because we get them in vegetables when we go to like farmers markets or whatnot, but technically they are considered a fruit. Here we have Hesperidiums, where we have our pericarp, the fleshy part surrounding the seeds, and then finally here drupes and stone fruit, where we have the pericarp surrounding the seed. For our dry fruits are going to be like our beans and our poppies. And so our dry fruits are broken up into dehiscent, where the fruit has to split, and indehiscent, where the fruit does not split. So such as like strawberries, grains, maples. Aggregate and multiple fruit are formed from several ovaries. The most common one that you would see are going to be our berries, so like strawberry, blackberry, and raspberry. This would be something that you'll likely go over in the lab. Here the achenes being these little seeds right here. We have multiple, where we have many individual ovaries that are fused together on a common stalk, such as figs. We have pineapples, mulberries, and mulberries. The seeds are actually a mature ovule. There are many types, but they all contain three basic parts: the embryo, the food storage tissue, and finally the seed coat. So if you can think about it going from inside to out, center, the middle, like in between the seed coat and the embryo, we have food storage tissue, and then finally the seed coat, which protects and keeps everything in the same seed. The embryo is actually the plantlet from fertilization. This is where you will find the radicule and the plumule. It also contains the cotyledons, so monocot or dicot. Our food storage tissue is going to contain the endosperm. It also is important for giving food to the cotyledons. It contains the perisperm and some of those components. So in the food storage tissue, we have the endosperm, we have food for the cotyledons, and the perisperm. So here is the the radicle and the plumule. The seed coat is actually fairly impervious to water. So if you've ever made like a pot of beans, so like if you ever make red beans and rice like from scratch, or maybe some black-eyed peas, you might have seen your mom like soak those in water for a little while overnight, and that's going to allow those to kind of swell up and become a little bit bigger. But it takes a long time for that water to imbibe into the seed so that it kind of